Greetings, class, and welcome to the first chapter of our main textbook, The Western Heritage, The Birth of Civilization. And for each of the chapters of the textbook, we'll be walking through just some of the essential elements, kind of some of the key questions and some of the issues that may or may not be covered directly in the text. And let's get things started here. I know some of you are going to probably be asking the question, so will this be on the test? And the answer is that's a good possibility that some of the information from these presentations and this PowerPoint could be on your test at the end of each unit. But more importantly, my hope is that some of the things you'll learn and pick up on as you listen to these discussions will be more helpful for life's test, to prepare you to actually have conversations with friends and to go deeper and understand how God's Word actually fits in with the historical story. For all the chapters that you will be reading, I want you to always kind of gauge, what are your first impressions? Did you recognize any signs of bias in the chapters, or do you find anything that the author said that you possibly disagreed with? And as you recognize those things, again, I hope the answer to that question is yes, I did recognize some. But ask yourself, well, why do I disagree? And is the textbook author, are they right? Are they wrong? And so that we're trained to recognize it, first of all, recognize our own, and then see if maybe we need to either correct our views or learn how we can more respectfully give some information to others who have a different bias than our own. One of the things that you might be asking as we are taking a Western civilization course is, why are we starting with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the land in between, those two places, and ancient civilizations as a whole? What's the connection when Western history is usually focused on Europe, eventually the United States, and a few other locations? And it's because these areas lay the foundation for Western worldviews, for Western ways of thinking, for Western culture, and we wouldn't be able to understand Western civilization unless we had a foundational understanding of what went on in these other areas long ago. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, really quickly, before we actually get into the contents, I just want to highlight the goals of this presentation itself. What I'm not seeking to do is to actually cover everything from the reading. That's part of what the reading is for, and so don't expect me to hit all the highlights and everything that will actually be on the exam. Instead, I want to highlight some of the important themes from the text, things that I think stand out and are worth drawing a little extra attention to. I want to integrate some information that is not found in the text themselves. This gives opportunity for a little biblical integration, right? What does God's Word have to say, or what was going on from a biblical perspective in some of these areas? And then just to model in general some of the types of questions that I'd encourage you to be asking as you read the various texts. So not any specific questions, but just the idea of that I want you to be questioning everything you read along the way and looking at it with a critical eye. Not a critical spirit, but a critical eye. So early humans and their culture. One of the things you probably would ask yourself, something is like this: how would you describe the worldview represented in the book as it discussed who humans are? And early on in the chapter on page 6, you should get some sense, right, that the book's worldview is an old earth view, but it says that humans are distinguished by a unique capacity to construct culture. So the book does acknowledge that humankind is different than animals, different than the rest of nature, as we can construct culture. Now, the definition of culture would be something like a way of life invented by a group and passed on by teaching. This would include material items, ideas, institutions, beliefs, language, etc. Now, according to most of your textbooks, the first humans, right, lived in what would be considered the Paleolithic, or the Old Stone Age, right? They would use old stone tools like the ones in the picture here. And a lot of historians would say that was somewhere between 1 million BC, or they'd see before the Common Era, and up to 10,000 BC. Right, these are nomadic cultures, people who would hunt and gather and couldn't stay in any one place for very long, not necessarily very large communities. But even these communities, according to your textbook, we have evidence that there is a suspicion that there is more to the world than meets the eye. That's from page 6. And when we look at cave drawings, some of their burial practices, it seems like from the very beginning, the most ancient cultures, ancient humans, sensed that there was more to the world than what they could see around them. The next age that we'll talk about is the Neolithic Age, or the New Stone Age. How we describe this period? Well, new tools are being used. So comparatively, we're going to see some more refined stone tools. And it's also a period where I would argue that it was a very slow evolution to get to this point, right? We're saying 1,000,000 years went by before people all of a sudden went from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to actually being agriculturally based and being able to grow their own food and to set up communities where they could actually build cities and have more people living in one place at one time. So again, according to most textbooks, not a lot happened in a long period of time. Right? It only took about 1,000,000 years for us to gather this little bit of technology. Right? So out of this, we're going to get the development of more cities. And an example, right, that your textbook mentions is the ancient city of Jericho. Right? And it's interesting that it mentions that archaeology points out massive stone walls encircling a section about 8 acres, right? And so when we read in Joshua, the first couple of chapters of Joshua about the ancient city of Jericho, it's interesting, right? We wonder how big it really was. And so I'm a visual learner. And here, this would be the equivalent of about 1 acre if you're comparing it to a football field. So put all those together and imagine you could put a lot of people in one city, gathering them into the inner city under those huge walls. So again, we get a little biblical reference here to the ancient city of Jericho. So fitting a worldview, one of the things that's unique about the Neolithic stone period was it says the order in history is that where people were trying to control nature rather than respond to it. And it's interesting because the biblical account in Genesis 1 says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground, right? It's interesting that your textbook seems to indicate that people were doing something negative by trying to control nature and to subdue it. But in the biblical account, we see people are actually doing what God intended for human beings to actually do. And you could ask yourself, why does that even matter? Well, it's because in our current culture and current age, we don't want to refer at all to man's responsibility to actually subdue the earth, right? When we talk about Earth Day, we want to let the earth alone, right? We want to make sure that we are taking care of the environment, which there's nothing wrong with that, but to the point that humans aren't in a position, or they're actually shamed or looked down on for trying to control the world around them. So we're going to start to get into actually the births of what we would consider civilizations, and civilization we'll define here in just a second. Kagan and company in your textbook, that's your author, so as I refer to Kagan, I'm just talking about those who edited your main textbook. They describe the hallmarks of civilization. So what takes a group of people from just a culture or a nomadic tribe into what we would call an actual civilization? And he argues that, right, first of all, urbanism, the fact that they actually are able to develop cities that would include art and monuments and a lot of people living in tight spaces or closer together. Our civilization requires long-distance trade for influence on people around them and survival, so they're not isolated from other groups. A writing system for the sake of communication, management, organization. Accelerated technology. So again, massive buildings, bronze tools, monuments, and social developments. So you won't just have a few people with maybe a patriarch or a matriarch, but you would actually have whole subdivisions and classes of people, right? And so just some examples of the types of weapons and tools that are being developed in this Bronze Age, approximately 3100 to 1200 BC, according to your textbook. So some ancient early civilizations up to 1000 BC, who are the earliest known. We've got Egypt, right, and they settled around the ancient Nile River, which flooded just at the right time every year for the people to grow the crops necessary for them to be able to survive and stay in a place that otherwise, right, apart from the river, is more desert-like. And then the ancient Mesopotamians, the land between the rivers, the Tiger or the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Tiger is always on top, is the easy way to remember those north to south. But they would use a complex series of dikes to actually bring water to the various city-states that they're going to develop in ancient Mesopotamia. Right, so ancient Mesopotamian civilization, also called the Fertile Crescent, right, because it's again along the rivers and is a more fertile area that made sense for people to be able to settle down and have farms and create these civilizations. So here's a map of it. Right, Sumer itself, right, was one of the first cities and then the first civilizations that historians say was actually developed and formed, right? And your book talks about, right, early Babylonians, the Amorite dynasty. There's the Akkadians, a number of different groups that developed in this region. For our intents and purposes of interest, is that right in Genesis 11:31 we say Abraham himself, or Abram, when he was called out by God to travel to the promised land they didn't know anything about, was called from Ur of the Chaldees. So he was actually from one of the ancient and very highly developed Sumerian civilizations, right? Also of note of this, you can't talk about ancient Mesopotamian civilizations without mentioning the famous Code of Hammurabi, right? One of their rulers in the 18th century BC that is the first, not the first law code available, but the first that survived down to the present day. And so we've got a lot of examples and phrases and ideas from them. I'll give you a sample here in just a second. The Code of Hammurabi. When Anu the Sublime, king of the Anunkayan, Bel, the lord of heaven and earth, who decreed the fate of the land, assigned to Marduk, the overruling son of Ea, god of righteousness, dominion over earthly man, and made him great among the Igigi. They called Babylon by his illustrious name, made it great on earth, and founded an everlasting kingdom in it, whose foundations are laid so solidly as those of heaven and earth. And those who are familiar with the biblical text will see and hear a lot of comparison to what we see in biblical scriptures, right? An everlasting kingdom, right? A God of righteousness, dominion over earthly man. So other things that the Mesopotamians were famous for, right? They're writing mathematics early on. They developed cuneiform, right, which is a block writing written in clay, thousands of symbols. So this isn't something that you necessarily want to be doing your homework in today. In fact, mainly the elites would learn to read and write. Right? They developed accurate calendars. They studied the stars and astronomy. It's from them that we get the sexagesimal system, 60-minute hours, right? 60 seconds in a minute, 360-degree circles, etc. And of note also, we get the writings of Enheduanna, right, one of the princesses of the ancient Akkadians, and she's history's first identifiable author. So right, we have more, our oldest writings are actually from Enheduanna, and of note, right, to those out there, is that she was a female, right, and is an example of cuneiform. Right, let's talk about religion for just a second, right? So ancient Mesopotamians were famous for having built ziggurats, right? Tall towers, usually for religious purposes. And some have conjectured that the Tower of Babel may have been, right, an ancient ziggurat, really large, maybe supposed to be the chief of all the ziggurats. And there was a phrase in there, I was curious what your thoughts are. What do you make of the statement that the Mesopotamians' sacred literature influenced the composition of the Hebrew Bible, right? A lot of us would be coming from a perspective or a bias that says that God's word, right, is the final foundation of truth. So how could it be impacted by the writings of the Code of Hammurabi, for example, right? Especially when we see things in the text, and according to Kagan, right, that we see gods with very human characteristics and needs. And that doesn't sound like the God of the Bible, right? Psalm 50:12 tells us, in it, God says, if I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you. If I was thirsty, right, I don't need the blood of bulls and goats. He says, look, I don't need you. I just want your sacrifices of thanksgiving, right? So you're going to get a real contrast. So how is it possible that the Hebrew Bible could be influenced by these ancient Mesopotamian civilizations and writings? This brings us to an interesting question. Technically speaking, right, which came first, the Code of Hammurabi or the Pentateuch? If we're going to be historically accurate, the Code of Hammurabi was from approximately 1760 BC, whereas Abraham, they're right, didn't write the Pentateuch until approximately the 1440s BC. Right? So which influenced which would be an interesting question, and how do we as Christians reconcile the two? I don't want to give you the full answer because you're going to get to discuss that amongst yourselves, but I will just point out a couple of quick observations. First of all, as Christians, we need to be aware that all truth is God's truth. And so just because a civilization may be pagan and may not believe in the God of the Hebrew Bible, from the beginning, they're going to have glimpses of truth. They're people created in God's image who we should be surprised if they had no truth whatsoever in what they wrote. So we should expect and hope that the Code of Hammurabi and other ancient documents that aren't Christian or of the God of the Hebrews per se, we should be surprised if they don't actually have some glimmer of who God is in them, right? And as a specific example, the book of Deuteronomy, right, written by Abraham, takes on the format, the outline of a Hittite, who we'll talk about shortly, suzerain vassal treaty. So the way that it's broken down actually looks very much like an older example of the Hittites. And you say, well, why would God allow that? It's because God is a great communicator. Because God is good at communicating to people in their culture, in their language, in a way that they'll understand and be able to grasp what his purposes are. So I don't think we need to be overly discouraged or frustrated that someone would say that the code and some of its ideas can be seen overlapping in the Pentateuch, which came a few centuries later. Right? A couple other thoughts on religion. Right? They're highly superstitious according to your textbook. Right? They like to, your text says, read organs. For example, the organs of animals. And up here we have an example, right, of, actually this would be a training tool, the liver of a sheep or an animal, that young priests would be trained in how to read the future, depending on what you would see when you cut open an animal liver. Right? Ezekiel 21:21, sorry, backs that up. It talks about the king of Babylon, right, now stands at the fork, uncertain whether to attack Rabbah or Jerusalem. So he's up to the north of the ancient land of Israel, and he's trying to decide which side of the Jordan River he should travel down with his army. Should he attack ancient Rabbah or Jerusalem? And so it says he calls on his magicians, and he uses divination. They cast lots and shake arrows out of the quiver. They inspect the livers of their animal sacrifices. And we know from the story as it continues that he does end up heading towards Jerusalem and sacking the city at the time. Right, and finally, this is maybe the more sad thing of all, Mesopotamian civilizations, according to your textbook, didn't have hope in death. Right? They didn't believe that life was going to get better. Thankfully, we don't mourn as those who have no hope, 1 Corinthians 15. And not unlike the ancient Egyptians, we'll talk about in a second, their servants were actually sacrificed at their rulers' deaths. So now we're going to transition to chatting about Egyptian civilization. And just to provide a little confusion, Upper Egypt is actually upstream, but because the Nile River flows from south to north, right, Upper Egypt actually refers to the southern part of Egypt, and Lower Egypt then is to the north. So for context, right, the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and really from that point on, the Pharaoh himself would be viewed as a god who was working with the other gods to maintain ma'at, or equilibrium, or the balance of the universe. The ancient capital of the Egyptian Empire civilization was Memphis. This is not Memphis, Tennessee, just for clarification. And one of the huge architectural achievements of the Old Kingdom was Khufu's Great Pyramid. Remember, a hallmark of civilization is, right, the huge or significant monuments. Right, 13.1 acres at the base. So ancient Jericho, right, we said was only 8 acres, surrounded by high walls. So this is even bigger than ancient Jericho. 481 feet high in the middle, so over a football field and a half straight up. Required 2.3 million blocks of stone that averaged 5,000 pounds each. Remember, and this is built without modern technology. Right, here's a picture of it. And then for size, just check out, right, the people in comparison to the size of this ancient pyramid and the size of some of these blocks. So what an achievement, the ancient stone pyramid, the Great Pyramid of Khufu. So following the Old Kingdom, we get the first intermediate period, or is known as the Middle Kingdom. And well, there's a lot we could say about it. For our intents and purposes of interest, is it's during this period of ancient Egyptian history that Joseph and Israel are moved down to Egypt in around 1800 BC or so. So this brings us to the second intermediate period. It's in this period that there's a group called the Hyksos. We're not sure if they're from Western Africa, Southern Africa, but they came in and they actually conquered the Egyptian Empire. Then they turned right around and adapted a lot of the practices, the culture, the religion, even the terminology of the Egyptians themselves. And it's during this period that we're going to get a lot of monumental building projects built throughout the empire. And that makes sense, right, when you think about the people of Israel, the Hebrews being in Egypt at this period, right, and right in the middle of this period, 1446 approximately, is when we have the Exodus, when the Hebrews leave the land. But a lot of these building projects likely were built by the Hebrews themselves. And it would make sense when you read at the beginning of Exodus and you see that Pharaoh forgot about Joseph and the Hebrews and his history with them. Well, it makes sense if it was a completely different line, a different family, a different people group that had come in and conquered in the meantime. And one of the questions you kind of have to ask, right, is, well, what happened to the pharaohs, and why don't we have much record in Egyptian history of the Exodus itself? Well, on the one hand, you can't blame the Egyptians for not highlighting a period maybe in their history where 10 plagues occurred, right, and God's wrath was brought down on them, and they had to let over 1 million slaves out of the land. But it's interesting, right, when you read the biblical account, you see on the one hand, right, that Pharaoh dies at the Red Sea. And we already know he let the people go because of the death of his firstborn. So who would have actually ruled? And there's some theories out there that the person who actually ruled after the Hebrews left was Thutmose the Fourth. And right in between, right, the Great Sphinx, there's this stele, this little bitty monument that has his description of how he came to actually be the king. I'm going to read part of that inscription for you here. So the background of this dream stele, as it's called, right, Thutmose actually says in there that he came traveling at the time of midday, and he rested in the shadow of this great god, right, the great and ancient Sphinx. It says, sleep in a dream took possession of him, and all of a sudden one of the gods actually speaks to him, right, as if a father speaking to a son, and he says, look, I'm your father Hemakat Kipri Ratum, and I shall give to you the kingship. And it raises the question, well, why did he have to get the acknowledgement of a god that he should be the rightful heir to the throne, the rightful king, if he was just the next in line to be the pharaoh? And the argument is made that there's a good chance that his father, right, who had died in the Red Sea, and his older brother, who had died at the hand of the angel of death in the 10th plague, had been the reason that he was able to be the next king or the pharaoh, and he needed a way to establish that. So he might have come up with this story, right, of a God speaking to him and saying, this is what I wanted, this has been my will, that you would be the king. And so he actually had this stele, right, this inscription written out and put right in between the paws of the Great Sphinx that we can read about today. And regardless, right, of the exact details in the history and who was the king, by 1075 BC or so, Egypt is no longer going to be this massive imperial power. We're going to see the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans kind of dominating this territory. In fact, we see reference to that in the scriptures once again. We're reading from Isaiah 30, 1 through 5, as the Israelites and later the Jews were afraid of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and it says this, the Lord said, look at these children, referring to Israel. They don't obey me. They make plans, but they don't ask me to help them. They make agreements with the other nations, but my spirit does not want those agreements. These people are adding more and more sins to the ones they have already done. They are going down to Egypt for help, but they did not ask me if that was the right thing to do. They hope they will be saved by the Pharaoh. They want Egypt to protect them. It goes on. But I tell you, hiding in Egypt will not help you. Pharaoh will not be able to protect you. Your leaders have gone to Zoan, and your representatives have gone to Hanes, but they will be disappointed. They are depending on a nation that cannot help them. Egypt is useless. It will not help. Egypt will bring nothing but shame and embarrassment. And in 31 verse 1, woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, and rely on horses, and trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong. But they do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. So we know that they eventually are going to be defeated by not only the Assyrians, but then the Persians, Greeks, and Romans. And Egypt will never again, well, you could argue some in the present day, but have the status of one of the greatest of all ancient civilizations. Right, and just a few things about Egypt before we move on. We should probably are likely familiar with the idea of hieroglyphics, and they also come up with writing on papyrus, and that's where we get our paper today from, right? Taking these reeds and folding them out, and that's a little bit more convenient to carry paper to class as opposed to carrying stones, clay bricks to write in with cuneiform like the Sumerians and the Egyptians. The Mesopotamians. The religion of the Egyptians was certainly complex, right? They were superstitious and polytheistic, believing in multiple gods, we said, including the pharaoh. One exception was a guy named Amenhotep IV, or he renamed himself Akhenaten, right? And so one who was worshiper of the sun, the one god, he says, and he became monotheistic. And it's interesting, right? It didn't last for very long, but you wonder if he borrowed the idea from the ancient Hebrews of having just one powerful god. Right? The Egyptians also had a book of the dead that described what would happen after this life. So they did believe in life after death and needed to be prepared for it. And it's one of the reasons, right, that when a pharaoh died, many of his servants, and sometimes hundreds of them, would be sacrificed with the pharaoh to take care of him in the afterlife. So when pharaoh croaks, if you're close to the pharaoh, watch out. They may be taking your life as well. So one of the other ancient empires that has a huge impact eventually in some ways on Western civilization besides the Egyptians is the Hittites. And the Hittites, right, from modern day Turkey, but really controlled kind of the whole land in between Egypt and Mesopotamia for a significant period. Their existence was doubted by scholars for a number of years because the only reference to the Hittites was in the Bible itself. But in the late 19th century, a number of archaeological discoveries revealed that there was actually this ancient kingdom of Heth. The Hittite is referred to in the scriptures, and it really was one of those things that's been used to verify, again, the historicity of the Bible itself. Your text says they vied for control, actually, their texts say, of the land between, right, the land between these two empires, until they say the sea people arrived. And the sea people is probably referring to the Phoenicians, right, a group of traders, and it's the descendants, the Philistines are direct descendants of them, that came approximately 1200 BC and set up cities in Tyre and Sidon and down to the south, Gaza, Ashkelon, and others in modern day Palestine or Israel. We'll talk about that shortly. Right, the Hittites are important because they usher in the Iron Age, right? They discover a cheaper, stronger, more efficient metal than bronze and obviously the weapons and tools of the old Stone Age. So that's going to have a huge impact, especially as we get towards the Greek and Roman empires. Some famous biblical Hittites, just for fun here, right? Esau's wife, his second wife, that really bothered his parents. He took a Hittite, and they were pretty upset about that. But probably the most famous biblical Hittite is Uriah, right, who was one of David's mighty men, the husband of Bathsheba, and Uriah was murdered by David to cover up a nasty conspiracy. And again, it's evidence, right, that even in David's time, there still is this group, this reference to this Hittite kingdom, and it gives evidence to the testimony of the Israelite God, the Hebrew God, and how foreigners, right, Hittites, were being drawn to the truth and were willing to serve under the king of Israel. Another powerful empire in the ancient world was the Assyrians, with their capital at Nineveh. And the most famous story we have right on the Ninevites is the story of Jonah, and he had no desire to go to Nineveh, which we'll talk about why here in just a second. These are the northern neighbors, the Babylonian city-states. They had a number of strong rulers that are referenced in the Bible between 1000 and 665 BC. Shalmaneser is one, Sennacherib is another, Tiglath-Pileser, and a few others. Sennacherib is especially interesting because we have Sennacherib's prism, in which he describes bottling up the people of Judah in a cage. And yet for some reason, although he goes into great detail about having captured the city of Lachish just down the valley from Jerusalem and describes the battle, he doesn't describe taking the city of Jerusalem. Why wouldn't he describe taking the capital? And it's because if you read the biblical text, right, he never takes Jerusalem. He does surround it, but then the Lord sends his angel into the army overnight at the prayers of the king of Judah, and approximately 180,000 of his soldiers are killed in one night. So he goes back home. He can't exactly publish, right, that his 180,000 soldiers have been killed. That makes him look like a weak king. And so instead on his prism he describes how he bottled up the king of Judah like a bird. Right? Why were the Ninevites, the Assyrians, sorry, hated? It's because of their brutal army tactics. So they ruled by force, and they, in order to keep rebellions from arising, caused people to live in fear. They would constantly scatter and move people around. Some of their tactics include slinging the heads of their enemies into the cities that they were besieging. They would actually skin people alive and then plaster their flesh to the walls of cities that they captured as kind of a warning of how they would treat people who resisted them. And as we mentioned, they scattered people. And so they took, in 721 BC, when they captured the northern kingdom of Israel, they scattered them all over the Assyrian Empire. And at the same time, right, they brought other people that they conquered back into the land of ancient Israel. And this is where we get the Samaritans from, right? And when the Israelites and the Jews later are going to come to really hate them, it's because they are half-breeds, right, that have half of the truth, half of the true religion. 2 Kings 17 is a very strange story where we see that these Samaritans actually came in and God sent lions among them because they didn't know how to worship him in the land. And they request the Assyrian king to send a priest from ancient Israel to tell them how to worship properly. And so the Samaritans took the ancient Jewish religion, right, the religion of the Hebrews, and combined it with some of their pagan practices and really did have a mixed up religion that the Jews hated. So that when we get to John chapter 4 and the woman at the well for Samaria, it makes sense that she's confused about ancient history and what the people of Israel are expecting and where the Messiah will come from. Right, and eventually, though, before all that, the Assyrians, they fall to the Babylonians later, who are defeated by the Medes and the Persians. So really quickly on the Babylonians themselves, these are the Neo-Babylonians, because remember, back in those ancient Mesopotamian empires, we'd had a number of strong Babylonian rulers already, but we have Nebuchadnezzar and a few other kings, not many, that set up a short but incredibly powerful empire, right? In the book of Daniel, we read about how this is the golden head, right? Probably the most wealthy and powerful in some ways, but also the shortest lived. Right, they're the ones responsible for the captivity of Judah in 586 BC, right? And prior to that, a few other conquests in 605, 597, in which they took Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, or as they renamed them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, into their capital, where they served and continued to be a testimony of faithfulness to the true God. Right, and they collapsed in 539 under Darius the Mede, right, and he's working the Medes and the Persians together. Well, there's a picture of the ancient empire of the Babylonians. So in the middle of all these ancient empires, Mesopotamian and the Egyptian, and we've got the Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, there's what some people have referred to as the land between. And literally, it's the strip of land right along the Mediterranean coast between that and the desert that kind of connects the ancient modern world. Hence, it's called the land between. And today we call it, right, modern Palestine. And one of the questions we have to ask, and we'll talk about in a minute, is where we get that term Palestine from. But before we do, right, this territory it's historically been claimed by a number of groups. And the biblical account would say that it originally belonged right to the Canaanites, or the ancient Amorites, descendants of those Sumerians, Mesopotamians. We'll talk about their story here in just a minute. Remember, Abraham is called out of Ur of the Chaldeans to a promised land, and it's this land of the Amorites. And then you get the Phoenicians, right? And the Phoenicians, they're the sea people that are referred to kind of towards the end of the Hittite Empire. And they're going to take part of this territory for a short time until they're driven out by the Israelites. And then you get the Israelites and the Hebrews who, right, according to the biblical text, this was the land that was promised to them by God when he called Abraham out. So talking about just briefly the Phoenicians, just to get a little bit of their background, right, they're the ones, they add a more simple writing form. So instead of ancient cuneiform with thousands of symbols or hieroglyphics really difficult to learn, they come up with a simple Phoenician alphabet, very similar to actually the one we have today, and this is going to impact the Greek alphabet later. But they're known as traders in purple, right? And they would take this dye from these snails, and remember, purple or blue would have been colors of royalty, and so they had quite a significant trade along the seas with their dye, amongst other things. Carthage is a famous colonial outpost that we'll refer to in greater detail when we talk about Rome and the Punic Wars. And again, the Phoenicians and the Canaanites were driven out. And when you read the accounts of Joshua and then later the battles of the kings of Israel, and Israel, right, slowly but surely conquered and took over this territory. Well, I said I'd talk about the term Palestine and where we get that from. And it's called Palestine today, and some Arabic groups claim it today and say, well, the Palestinians, our descendants, have always been here. Well, the Palestinian, we get the word from the Philistines themselves, the ancient empire of the people of Israel. And that term Palestine was used in 134 AD when the Roman Emperor Hadrian was so fed up with and frustrated with the Jews constantly rebelling against the Roman Empire, he kind of wanted to blot out their name entirely. And so instead of calling it the land of Judah, where the Jews lived, or the land of Israel, he referred to it as Palestine. And it was kind of a slight, it was kind of a slander at the ancient Israelites and saying, we're going to call this territory after your ancient historical hated enemies, the Philistines. So when you hear the term Palestine today, that's the actual origin of the term. So the nation that claims part of the territory that we call Palestine today, right, and they have their homeland, Israel, is the Israelites or the ancient Hebrews. And right, their claim, their historical claim, is that Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldees, right, called to the land of Canaan, and God told him, this is the land that I promised you and your descendants after you. But then they're going to go down into Egypt for a stretch of time before they go back to the land of Canaan, right, the promised land, and they're going to conquer it and name it Israel, right, after Jacob, the son of Abraham, the grandson of Abraham. In Genesis 12, it says that the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. And the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nations they serve as slaves. And this is referring probably to the Egyptians, right? And afterward they will come out with great possessions, which they did. You, however, Abraham, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And here we get a sense of the Lord's judgment on the Amorites, but also his mercy that he is willing to wait 400 years to give them opportunity to repent and to change before he judges them and gives that land to Abraham and his descendants. Now we could talk a lot about ancient Israel, but one of the things that's going to tie this chapter and these various civilizations to Europe and to the Western world, and one of the reasons we have to start here is because of the impact of Israel on the worldview of the West. And even Kagan and company, who don't necessarily have a bias towards Christianity, on page 6 say this about ancient Israel and their significance. One of the region's smallest states probably had a greater influence on the course of Western civilization. The modern West's major religions, probably, that's be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are rooted in the traditions of ancient Israel. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all hugely influential today in the Western world, have their roots right here in this land between and the history with the people Israel. So let's kind of wrap up the chapter here. Right? The general outlook, as we're summarizing the Middle Eastern cultures here, it's interesting. Your book says that they are trying to understand their relationship to deity. And whether they're polytheistic or monotheistic like the Hebrews, right, there's a sense of they're trying to answer worldview questions. If there's a God, who are we and how do we relate to him? Right? And your book actually says that the deities that the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians believed in were seen as fairly irrational, unpredictable. You couldn't really tell. You just had to make sure you didn't make them too angry. And he also describes that are gods that are made in man's image, whereas, right, we know that the opposite is true, that man is actually made in God's image. How did these different groups feel about God's law and justice? In other words, their worldviews? Well, to summarize, right, Mesopotamians, they believed that the kings ruled for gods. They believed laws were subjective, right? It's whatever kind of the king said, and rulers were to be feared. They didn't have a lot of hope for what came after this life. The Egyptians, right, they believed Pharaoh was a god, but justice also still wasn't very rational, right? They did believe in an afterlife, but there wasn't a whole lot of hope in it. Whereas, according to your textbook, right, again, this is not a Christian textbook, the Hebrews believed that God was wrathful But we know that he was also rational, right? He would say to his people, come, let's reason together. Hear me out, right? Your sins are the reason that these consequences and judgments are coming upon you. Turn to me. He says, the book says he was righteous, in other words, holy and merciful at the same time. He was just and he was gracious. And for the Hebrew people, life was purposeful. They were living to know and worship and love as they were loved by the one true God. So in life and death, they had every hope. If you had to choose which of these ancient worldviews you'd want, it seems a no-brainer that the Hebrew one is at least the most attractive, and I would argue the most true. So toward the Greek and Western thought, this is interesting. We're going to try to start connecting, right, the Middle East to the ancient Greeks, or towards Western civilization as a whole. And your book wraps up the chapter by saying, right, ancient Greek thought was a lot like the Mesopotamian religion. They believed in magic, they're superstitious, polytheistic, believed in ancient fables. And yet it says in the 6th century BC, there was a movement toward more rational or naturalistic explanations of the flow of history. In other words, gods aren't seen as important and as to be feared. People are trying to trust their own ability to reason and explain the events in the world around them. According to your text, the direct quote, it says, they began to seek naturalistic, rational explanations for material phenomena and human behavior. Right? Rather than blame the gods, let's try to explain these from a human perspective. The textbook goes on, and as we ask about, right, is there bias in that statement? Well, it's saying that if you don't believe in the gods, you're being more rational. Now, I'm not saying I believe in the ancient many gods and Mesopotamians, but the idea here is the claim that to believe in gods or God is irrational, and that's not necessarily a fair explanation. Right? The author theorizes at the end that philosophy and science, it says, as we understand them, and he's talking about now the modern day, could only develop once the Greeks had discarded supernatural explanations and reliance on divine intervention as ways of understanding the ancient world, right? And if you look at our modern world today, we do kind of discredit and we think of ancient civilizations as very superstitious, and we applaud the scientific, right, philosophical explanations for why people do what they do. And the final statement of the chapter on page 25 says, Greek law and democracy had begun to evolve into forms recognizable to us today, right? Because Western civilization down to the United States and Europe, right, is going to borrow from the ancient Greeks, who borrow from, in their turn, Mesopotamians, but they start to think more, as he says, rationally or naturally instead of looking to the gods. So as we wrap this up, right, which god would you want? Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Hebrew? Well, I'd choose the Hebrew god, but I'm biased, of course. And the Bible and history, right? Hopefully we've seen from this chapter, it was long, but that they go together, right? That they don't contradict one another. They actually flow really well. And as we move towards the next chapter, we're going to ask ourselves, okay, so what about the Greeks? And as we get into, right, the study of the West itself, what big questions are people trying to answer about them? And we're going to talk about in this next chapter what are some of the more famous pole or Greek city-states. Thank you for taking the time to listen through this, and I will look forward to interacting with you more over this next 8 weeks. God bless.